Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today I want to take you to Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, daybreak, June 15th, 1863. Major William Goldsborough, the man pictured here, and skirmishers from the Confederate 2nd Maryland Infantry, which belonged to the All Maryland Force known as the Maryland Line, proceeded cautiously through the streets of Winchester, Virginia. Spirited fighting just a few hours before led to a rout of the Federals that had occupied the town, and Goldsborough's troops moved to the distant sound of battle between their comrades and retreating enemy forces. Soon, Goldsborough and his men came upon Star Fort, part of the defenses of now Confederate occupied Winchester. They took possession of it, and about 200 Union troops who were caught inside. According to one account, Goldsborough made a prisoner of his own brother, Charles, who was fighting for the Union side as an assistant surgeon in the 5th Maryland Infantry, U.S. Army. Charles Goldsborough was sent to Libby Prison in Richmond, and Goldsborough moved out with his men to continue the northern invasion that would end a couple weeks later in Gettysburg. During that battle at Gettysburg on July 2nd, Goldsborough took charge of his regiment after the commander was wounded during an attack on Culp's Hill. The regiment carried a portion of the enemy breastworks despite the loss of many men. The Marylanders were ordered to attack the position again the next morning. That's July 3rd, 1863. Goldsborough remarked to one of his captains, quote, "It was nothing less than murder to send men into that slaughter pen," end quote, referring to what was going on around Culp's Hill. However, the order wasn't imperative, and the disastrous charge that followed devastated the regiment. More than 2/3 of the Marylanders became casualties, including Goldsborough. A bullet found him ripped into the left side of his chest, entering at his third rib, passed through his lung, and exited out his back. Friends, comrades carried him to a nearby house with 3 other grievously wounded officers, probably assuming that they would die there. They fell into enemy hands instead, and Goldsborough survived. He spent the next 9 months in hospitals in Gettysburg and Baltimore, which was sort of a grim homecoming for him because he had worked in Baltimore as a printer before the war began. While Goldsborough recuperated in Baltimore, his brother Charles, who had been captured, as you may recall, he was paroled and returned north to his home in Baltimore, where he now found his Confederate brother William Goldsborough wounded. This time, the roles were reversed. William Goldsborough was now the prisoner. The reunion was brief. In early 1864, Charles, the Union surgeon, left for Virginia. William Goldsborough, the Confederate, was discharged from the hospital, imprisoned in Fort McHenry, which was being used at that time as a Confederate prisoner, and then transferred to Fort Delaware in Delaware. William Goldsborough holds a unique distinction between August and October of 1864, as the war was winding down into its last months. Goldsborough was one of 600 officers who were sent to Charleston, South Carolina, and confined in a stockade in the line of enemy artillery fire, for 45 days. These 600 Confederate officers lived in constant threat of death. They were used effectively as human shields. For those of you who are students of the Civil War, you're probably familiar with those 600 officers who were eventually known as the Immortal 600 for being part of those harrowing weeks. In fact, no Confederate soldier that was in the line of fire was killed as a result of fire, but 3 reportedly died of starvation. After all that was over, federal authorities sent Goldsborough back to Fort Delaware, where he remained for the rest of the war. He eventually gained his release in 1865, signed the Oath of Allegiance to the Constitution, and returned to Winchester, Virginia, that place where a couple years earlier he had that triumphant entry into town and the capture of Star Fort. There, he established a newspaper, the Winchester Times. He was really quite a good writer as well as a printer. If you get a chance, I recommend you check out his book, The Maryland Line in the Confederate Army. It was first published in 1869, and you can find it in the Internet Archive. Easy, just search The Maryland Line in the Confederate Army in Goldsborough, and you'll find it. It's a very good read. Goldsborough focuses, and he says this, it's not really a military history, it's a history of the men who served. So it's full of anecdotes. About 1869, after the book was published, he sold the Winchester Times and moved to Philadelphia, where he became a printer for the Philadelphia Record. About 1890, he moved to the West and worked for 2 newspapers in the state of Washington. About 1894, he comes back to the East, returns to Philadelphia in the Record as shop foreman for the printers, and he retires 2 years later. He retired really not by choice. He was actually run over by a bicycle. After all of the war, all of his travels, he's hit by a bicycle. He's forced to walk with the aid of crutches for the rest of his life, survives until Christmas Day, 1901, when he dies at age 70. On his deathbed, he told his wife, quote, "Don't bury me among the damn Yankees here," end quote. She honored his wish, truly an example of an unrepentant Confederate soldier. His body was interred along hundreds of veterans on Confederate Hill in Baltimore's Loudon Park Cemetery. So there you have the story of William Goldsborough of the Confederate 2nd Maryland Infantry, his exploits during the war, including the capture of his own brother. If you find a photograph of Charles Goldsborough, surgeon of the 5th Maryland Infantry, U.S., let me know. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.